Germany is about to do a complete overhaul of its civil defense infrastructure, i.e. bunkers. Now, as NATO arms its new F-35s with nuclear weapons, the new nuclear weapons, nothing coincidental about the fact that the new nukes are now ready for the newly certified F-35A stealth fighter jets to carry them. More on that story in just a moment, but the German Association of Cities and Municipalities has now called for huge investments in the construction of new bunkers, as was reported by Der Spiegel. This is typical with governments. First, there is underreaction, then there is panic buying, then there is overreaction. Recall the pandemic. I was one of the first people wearing a mask inside the grocery store getting weird looks. I didn't care because at that point in time, we didn't know if this was the real deal or not. Fast forward a few weeks, I was the one trying to avoid that while everybody else was giving me ugly looks for not donning the mask, okay? So this is how quickly the government is going to shift the narrative. Remember when Fauci said masks don't work, or was it the Surgeon General or somebody like that? And on a dime, they completely changed to, if you don't do this, you're crazy. As is the case right now in Germany and other places across Europe, where they're now chastising the population who they once ridiculed for partaking in any sort of preparedness endeavors like this, are now saying that you are irresponsible and crazy if you don't do that. Now, that hasn't quite caught up with the mainstream yet entirely, but it will. And what's going to happen now is that this is going to put immense amounts of stress on the supply chain, because now you're going to have the governments of the world competing with private individuals like ourselves who want to get prepared for the same NBC air filtration systems, the water filtration systems, the off-grid power solutions, from the inverters to the batteries, to the solar panels, to the wind turbines, hydroelectric, geothermal, anything that's associated with building an off-grid retreat is now going to be a much more competitive marketplace. The supply is simply not going to be there in an already inflationary environment, because what this indicates is that the government is now going to start panic buying this stuff. They are underreacting first, and then they overreact. Now we're going to see the overreaction. The publication notes that the organization considers it extremely important that the federal government invests at least 1 billion euros a year in protecting the population in the case of war. He called the construction in Germany of a large number of new modern bunkers, bomb shelters, and other similar structures as one of the most important measures. According to him, 2,000 existing public shelters from the Cold War, of those, only 600 have actually survived and can only accommodate 500,000 people of the, 85 million strong population in Germany. Now recall, just a few days ago, the leaders of Germany did an impromptu exercise that had them simulate a retreat to a nuclear bunker. Now, in light of everything else that we're seeing unfold in Eastern Europe, with NATO committing to a full-blown military mobilization for war with Russia, this should be concerning. There should be no incredulity at this point in time on the part of the masses. I know there's a lot of people who still lurk in the comment section, rationalizing their own indecision and lack of preparedness, reprimanding me on a daily basis, calling me a fearmonger, and saying that all we want to do is sell people stuff. I was a customer long before I was a seller, okay? And the only reason why I became a seller is because I seen a need that was not being fulfilled. There was a lot of bad actors in the space, and I wanted to remedy that. To be brutally honest, it was probably something I should never have undertook, because it takes up a lot of my time and I can't focus on my own preparedness endeavors. And the amount of time I spend on the store aspect of this takes away from the ability to produce more higher quality content, which is something that we want to continue to do. Regardless, the point I'm trying to make is, as was a point I expressed with Dr. Bradley Garrett in the interview we put out yesterday, one of the first in-house podcast formats that we released, I really enjoyed the conversation. A lot of people enjoyed the video. I would encourage you to go check it out. But the point I was trying to express to him in his book that he wrote, Bunkers, Preparing for the End Times, this is a very well-educated individual, a lot of experience. One of the criticisms I levied against the book was the characterization of anybody in the space as a dread merchant, as somebody who is just trying to profit off people's insecurities and fears. And I liken that criticism to that of the psychopharmaceutical industry. While there's a lot of bad actors in the not just psychopharmaceuticals, but pharmaceuticals in general, while there's a lot of bad actors in insurance, in the medical industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, there still is a need there that needs to be served. There's a legitimate demand for a service. There's a problem that needs to be solved. Now, oftentimes what happens is that people will go over and above and cater to these very fringe paranoid insecurities that people have. This is something I've never done. If somebody called me up and said, hey, I'm planning for Planet X to create some sort of weird imbalance in the magnetosphere or something, I'd be like, man, I'd probably just hang up the phone, because I'm in the business of preparing people for the things that I talk about on this channel every day that are not only plausible, but are culminating right now in the same way that we've said they were going to for the longest time. So everybody who said that this was never going to happen, that NATO was never going to go to war with Russia, you're seeing it unfold before our very eyes. And I would encourage you to seize upon this opportunity before the government really enters the space. I mean, they've already been doing this in secret, competing, bidding up the prices already behind the scenes, but now it's an open secret and they're all starting to prepare openly. The Estonian government is doing it as well. The Estonian government announced its intention to require developers to have a bomb shelter in newly constructed multi-story residential buildings and public buildings, okay? According to the Interior Minister, based on the experience of Finland, where shelters are mandatory, shelters inside shelters are mandatory, a bomb shelter increases the cost of housing construction by only 1 or 2%. And this is a great point, and this was one of the things that I tried to get Dr. Bradley Garrett to think about yesterday, is that a bunker is multi-purpose. And I'm not in the business of selling bunkers, but there's a reason why I want a bunker. It's not only because you could ride out nuclear fallout for 14 days, it's because it's a safe place to store stuff. It brings up the property value. The bunkers that Ron over at Atlas builds, they're going to outlast the property itself, okay, because it's underground. It's not going to succumb to erosion and all the usual weathering that you would get above ground. If it's built properly, it's going to be a safe room, a panic room. It can protect you against natural disasters. So there is nothing that you would ever purchase of a preparedness in the preparedness industry that is never going to have some utility to it, whether it's a knife, an axe, camping supplies, emergency food, as long as you get the right stuff. None of that stuff is ever going to go to waste. It's not like insurance in the sense that you may never have to use insurance and you're just paying into it and paying into it. It's your own material insurance that is always going to have a utility. Anyways, I think the time for justifying the need to prepare and trying to help people rationalize why they should get prepared is over, because the government is now entering the space en masse. And if you haven't surmised yet that we're living in the age of polycrisis, I don't think there's anything that can convince a person. And I assure you that those people who lurk in the comment section, who make these accusations against channels like this, are going to be some of the most reckless people in an SHTF situation. But the fact that they continuously present themselves day after day in spite of admonishing us for doing what they accuse us of is a sign that in the back of their minds, they still realize that this is a legitimate threat. And for whatever reason, it's a defense mechanism, because they don't want to face the reality that they are ill prepared. And this is typically, I think, the approach of a lot of people. A lot of people who are going to become the most diehard of preppers are going to resist it almost aggressively at the start, because you know they realize how unprepared they are, and the only way to rationalize your lack of preparedness is to pretend like nothing is going to happen, okay? Is to be a proponent of the normalcy bias. And this is why people who eventually are some of the most hardline preppers are also the ones who at the start, were maybe the most reluctant to get involved in it. And this doesn't have to be something weird. This is just taking the prudent steps to be able to sustain your life, because the government is not going to be able. The German government is talking about $1 billion a year spread across 85 million people. What is that? Like $11 per person per year that they're going to invest. Meanwhile, you know that they're fully taking care of. Case in point, back in October of 2022, it's now come out in an article. I think it was either Politico or the New York Times, but they now came out and said that, oh yeah, by the way, back in October 22nd, there was a very high likelihood that this thing was going to go nuclear, and the US government was preparing for it. At that time, everybody called us crazy, right? Now, one thing that article gets wrong is the fact that they act almost as if that was the peak of the nuclear tension. The peak of nuclear tension is right now. It's today. Every single day that goes by, as you hear the rhetoric ramp up about deploying troops into Ukraine, every day that goes by, the nuclear risk increases. So one of the deceptive aspects of that article that's been circulating that was saying, and if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I don't have all the details of it, but basically it's new information that has come to light that suggests that the government of the United States was preparing for a nuclear war in October of 2022. Now, what was happening at that time? If you recall, Sergei Shoigu called up all of the other defense ministers of NATO, and he said that we know that Ukraine is getting ready to do some sort of radiological incident, some nuclear dirty bomb, possibly even a nuclear bomb, and if it happens, shit's going to hit the fan. Immediately, that put the brakes on whatever was about to happen. That was what this was referring to, I do believe, even though they don't say that. But this just goes to show that the government has a plan that they're not telling us. It took, 15, 16 months for this information to come to the surface. So right now, we know that tensions are higher than they've ever been before in talks of putting troops on the ground. So you can presume that right now they also have similar plans that they're wargaming and they're getting ready for. And this is why the deployment of the F-16s to carry, the F-35s to carry nuclear weapons, this is why this is so important, because they're getting ready. They have a plan, likely even have a plan for a decapitation strike. Now, with respect to all the waffling on the issue of whether or not they're going to send troops, I'm convinced that in itself is kind of a smokescreen, because what they've done now is they've moved the conversation and the debate towards, should we send troops? Everything that falls up under that, short of nuclear weapons, is now fair game. Whether it is the delivery of long-range weapon systems, the use of fighter jets, the delivery of new types of fighter jets, new types of missile and missile defense systems, all of that becomes no longer a subject of debate and essentially a foregone conclusion, because the topic now is moving the goalpost towards, should we put troops in Ukraine? That takes attention away from the fact that they're going to deploy these longer range missile systems into Ukraine that are going to allow them to target deep into Russian territory. And remember, we are but 72 hours away from the Russian election. Immediately after Vladimir Putin is reelected once again, we are going to see exactly how this is going to unfold. Now, arguably, we still have until the US election. If the Russians are patient enough with us, they might decide to wait, even though a lot of people are putting their eggs in the Trump basket thinking that he is going to de-escalate this situation. I would not count on it, because even Vladimir Putin, Medvedev, all of these guys have said that they understand full well that whoever they put up there, whether it's Trump or Biden or whoever else, that they're just a puppet of special interest lobby groups inside Washington, and that they're not the ones who are making the decisions. Okay, so it's very likely that, if anything, we're going to see some black swan event emerge. And understand that we are just one event away from everything, all the dominoes starting to fall at the same time. One misstep, one event at this point in time could create total chaos in the markets, in the geopolitical environment, in Europe, and everything could change on a dime, okay? And you're seeing that with the government now starting to accuse the population of being irresponsible because they didn't prepare, even though they criticized us all as being overly paranoid. In fact, coincidentally, interestingly, when I released that interview yesterday with Dr. Bradley Garrett, I don't know if somebody at CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is watching the channel, but they released an article on the exact same day that talks about the exact same subject. Okay, within hours of releasing our video, they released that video almost as if they knew we were going to release it on that day. And they mentioned Dr. Bradley Garrett in the book, which I find, or in the article, they actually interviewed him in January. So it's almost like, did they time this out? You know, did somebody catch wind that we were going to be releasing this video? And it's strange. But now, of course, the entire conception and characterization of preppers is now shifting. Remember, you were once crazy for wearing a mask in the grocery store, and a few days went by, and all of a sudden, if you weren't, they were hauling your ass off to jail. That's exactly what's going to be the case with this whole situation in terms of getting prepared for World War III, okay? So, as we talked about recently, the F-35 jets, the F-35A Joint Strike Fighter has now become the world's first stealth fighter to be greenlit to carry nuclear weapons. The new tactical B-61 gravity bombs, I believe, that have just been updated. And this is not coincidental that all of these things happen to fall, that new countries are joining NATO, the forward deployment of these stealth fighter jets, the training to launch from non-conventional runways. This is not a coincidence, guys, that all of this stuff just happens to fall in place ahead of schedule. They added that the F-35A achieved nuclear certification ahead of schedule, providing U.S. and NATO with a critical capability that supports U.S. extended deterrence commitments earlier than anticipated. So they knew this shit was going to hit the fan long ago, much like the Russians did, which is why arguably the Russians have been withholding some of their best military equipment, because they knew for the longest time that this was the fight that was going to be happening. We're about to see sparks fly after this election. I think that's when the masks fully come off. Okay, we're seeing right now this strategic ambiguous posturing about whether or not we're going to send troops, all a smokescreen for the foregone conclusion of escalating the conflict militarily. You're going to see the border in Western Ukraine cease to exist in the next few months, I do believe, as it becomes heavily militarized, as it already is. Now, switching gears into Israel, we're seeing right now Israel advance its own emergency war plans in the north. And a lot of attention has been taken away on this. Of course, the United States is setting up that emergency dock, which many people, including myself, is thinking that this could just be some kind of military tripwire or some Trojan horse to bring the U.S. military closer to the conflict. Of course, as the war in Gaza starts to dwindle, the war in Lebanon is going to heat up. So if the war in Gaza intensifies, that's going to put a lot of stress on an already stretched thin IDF military reserve and just an outstretched military. So what's happening right now is the IDF Homefront Command rapidly advanced in recent weeks a plan to designate mass bomb shelters in northern Israel. The army is setting up dozens of sites, primarily in underground parking lots, in response to a looming threat of full-scale war with Hezbollah. The IDF procured 80,000 food packages for distribution during wartime as part of the operation. Underscoring the scope of the threat, the emergency shelters are crucial for residents living in older buildings lacking fortified spaces, offering a sanctuary that can sustain them for days if necessary. So they are preparing for full-scale war with Lebanon. And one of the problems with all sides, whether you're pro-Ukraine, pro-Russia, pro-Hamas, pro-Israel, pro-Hezbollah, is that every side involved in this conflict has been accused of committing atrocities, whether it's in the mobilization of troops, whether it's in the crackdown against populations using human shields. The list goes on. abducting children or whatever, relocating people. All sides have been accused of committing war crimes, and this disincentivizes them from putting the brakes on the conflict, which ultimately brings us much closer to the nuclear terminus, because the leaders in charge have a vested interest in perpetuating the conflict, so to keep attention away from whatever misdeeds have occurred within these countries or their own political existence, for that matter, to stay in power. It's incentive for them to continue the conflict. So this is a very dangerous state of affairs that we're currently seeing unfolding here. I'm not going to comment on my own political speculations as they pertain to what the motivations are for Macron and the EU and NATO and the meeting with Trump and what's his face, the Hungarian President Orban. To me, all of this stuff it could be interpreted one way or the other depending on how you look at it. I think it's abundantly clear that Russia is viewed as an existential threat to the West, and they're going to do whatever they can to try to strategically defeat Russia without it going nuclear, but they're getting ready for that nuclear potential, and they are starting to rebuild their civil defense infrastructure. So if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, you can bet that it probably is. Okay, if you're interested in that CBC article I was talking about, it's called From Luxury Bunkers to Tactical Vehicles. The ultra-rich are preparing for the big one. And this was no like one paragraph article. It's a decent size. And, I'd encourage you to check it out and just play that podcast in the background. Again, it's one of the longer in-house podcast format videos we've done. I want to do more stuff like that. I like having those face-to-face conversations with people. And it's one of those things you put on in the background while you're gardening or you're organizing your preps, you're oiling the steel, whatever you have to do, just put it on. And I assure you that you're going to, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything that he says, one important thing to note is that this guy started being very skeptical of preparedness culture, okay? And this is what I think we often see. And I think, unfortunately, we mischaracterize people in the preparedness industry as just being out there to sell doom and gloom, forgetting that we ourselves, I was a prepper long before I ever had any goal or intention of starting a store. And oftentimes we take the most extreme examples of these individuals who are thinking that Planet X is going to come down or whatever, and then you extrapolate that to the entirety of the group. But important to understand that Dr. Bradley Garrett, who's an Oxford scholar, top tier academic, he at once thought prepping was kind of dumb and crazy and paranoid. Maybe not in those exact terms, but now he's living in a cabin in the woods. He has a bug out plan, he has a bug out vehicle, and he also has a acreage from which he has a plan to get from his bug out property or to his acreage to his bug out property, whatever situation arises. So that in there, case in point, having experienced all aspects of preparedness culture, surveyed all of not all of them, but many dozens, if not hundreds of bunker systems, subterranean fortresses around the world, he came to the conclusion, a very educated person who is very progressive, pro-social on the left, okay? He came to the conclusion that there's a reason to prepare. Now, everybody's reasons are going to be different. It really doesn't matter at this point. Prepare for tomato or tomato, it doesn't matter, because one of these black swan events is going to occur and it is going to change the course of our lives forever. We could talk about the Polish ministers insisting that there's already NATO troops in Ukraine. I mean, every day I'm getting tired of this issue almost, because I realize it's a smokescreen for the other thing that they're going to sneak in under the radar, which is the longer range weapon systems, and they're about to turn on the F-16s. And once that happens, operationally, the western border in Ukraine ostensibly ceases to exist, and that's when NATO is effectively in a de facto de jure possible state of war with them. So anyways, I think that's about all I care to talk about today. I might do a follow-up video. I want to talk about the Russians floating this idea of doing a nuclear strike sooner than later, okay? Sergei Karaganov wrote a very compelling article about why he's encouraging the Russian leadership to use nukes now in an escalate to de-escalate situation to avoid a full-blown nuclear confrontation later. And I do believe that this is something that is being taken very seriously in the upper echelons of the Russian leadership. So I might do another video later today. I'm sure there's going to be more news that arises to talk about. But anyways, guys, if you want to get prepared, there's a few ways to do it. Watch our videos on the dollar store prepping. If you're talking about just the consumerist component of prepping, you know, dollar store, Home Depot, Walmart. We're still going to do some other stores like Costco and Wholesale Foods, and we might do some more obscure ones just as a challenge, like IKEA or something. If you can find anything from that store that's going to be useful, we might go to some of these stores where you might not think you would find stuff, just as like a survivor man sort of exercise to see what could be used. But we do have a lot of blue strip content which actually gets into the more practical, functional, where we demonstrate how to do certain things, whether it's hunting, gardening, all that stuff. Unfortunately, it's less sensational, it's educational, it requires mental work. Not a lot of people like mental work, but you have to do these things if you truly are, you know, really wanting to have a fighting chance when things go sideways. You have to make sure you cover those bases. So go and check those videos out. And if you want to support the channel, CanadianPreparedness.com. But honestly, you watching this channel, liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing the videos, that's more than I can ask. So thanks for watching, guys. Take care. We'll see you in a bit.